I'm sorry, I'm not hearing.
Good morning, all. I would like to welcome everyone to the 10th virtual meeting of the Joint Select Committee on the Human Rights, Equality and Diversity. It's the committee's first public hearing into the role of the state in preserving the cultural heritage of the First Peoples, our Indigenous peoples of Trinidad and Tobago. As chairman, I would just like to remind participants that this is a virtual meeting and specific guidelines would apply, inclusive of making sure that you mute your microphones when you are not speaking, to keep background noises to a minimum, to adjust your camera so that your face is clearly visible when you speak, ensuring that notification from any electronic devices around you, inclusive of your cell phones, that in your vicinity of others as well, are all muted during the course of the meeting. Members of the listening and viewing audience are invited to post or send their comments via the Parliament's various social media platforms, inclusive of Facebook, Parlview, and the Parliament's YouTube channel and Twitter, which we will take into consideration during the course of the meeting. I would like to introduce the representatives in the following order. Ministry of Sport and Community Development, followed by the Office of the Prime Minister. Then we will flow into the Santa Rosa First Peoples Community, and then lastly, the Warao Nation. Ministry of Sports, Community and Development.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Donovan Knights. I'm the Policy Coordinator in the Ministry of Sport and Community Development. And we are representing the Permanent Secretary this morning, who would have indicated that she is not available to be here today.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Wilfred Fullerton, and I'm the Technical Director for the Project Management Unit of the Ministry of Sport and Community Development.
Ms. Anne Bell-Montez, Research Officer 2, Ministry of Sport and Community Development.
Office of the Prime Minister, Communications Division.
Good morning. My name is Avril Belfon. I am the Government Archivist and head of the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago. We are a division of the Office of the Prime Minister.
Good morning. Good morning. My name. Good morning. My name is Roma Wongsang. I'm the Senior Archives and Records Officer at the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago, a division, as Ms. Belfort said, under the Office of the Prime Minister Communications.
Can I have an introduction from the Santa Rosa First Peoples Community?
Good morning, Christo Adonis, PI of the Santa Rosa First Peoples Community.
I am Ricardo Barrett Hernandez, Chief of the Santa Rosa First Peoples Community.
Good morning again. I'm Professor Rosemary Antwine. I am a delegate of the Santa Rosa Peoples. In my day job, I'm Principal Designate of the University of the West Indies, but I think what's more relevant, former Rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, OAS.
And the introductions from the Warao Nation.
Morning, I am Rabina Shah, I'm Chief of the Warao Nation. Today, I am spokesman of the Warao Nation.
Anyone else from the Warao Nation would like to introduce themselves at your flanked by, sir?
I am Felix Water Jones, first elder in the Council of Elders of the Warao Nation of Trinidad and Tobago.
I am Selwyn Jacob, second elder in the Warao Nation. Good morning to everyone.
Good morning to all and welcome to our public inquiry. My name is Dr. Muhammad Yunus Ibrahim. I am chairman of this committee. Would invite all members to introduce themselves to you all, starting with Independent Senator Hazel Thompson-Ahi.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Hazel Thompson-Ahi, member of this committee, Senator, Independent Senator.
Other members, feel free to introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Anita Haynes, and I'm a member of this committee.
Good morning. My name is Jillian John. I'm a member. Thank you.
Good morning. Keith Scotland, member.
Good morning to all. Esmond Ford, member of this committee.
Many thanks and welcome again, everyone. Just a quick reminder of the objectives of the inquiry. It is to identify the measures adopted by the states to recognize the cultural contributions of the indigenous First Peoples, and for us to collectively determine the areas in which cultural recognition of the contribution of the First Peoples could be strengthened. I would like to have the following persons make brief remarks with a maximum of 2 minutes, and I ask on Ms. Dr. Donovan Knights from the Ministry of Sports and Community Development to start.
Good morning again, Donovan Knights of the Ministry of Sport. Mr. Chair and members of the Joint Select Committee, the Ministry of Sport and Community Development is guided by the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, founded on the principles that acknowledge the supremacy of God, faith in the fundamental human rights and freedoms, the dignity of the human person, and the inalienable rights with which all members of the human family are endowed. And in this regard, the treatment of our indigenous peoples and are assured of these rights and freedoms. The government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, through its various configurations of ministries with responsibility for culture, community development, and national diversity, both has and continues to invest in the preservation of the nation's national heritage and indigenous people, even before the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So in 2007, the government was really reaffirming its commitment to the protection of the rights and maintenance of the distinct cultures of the indigenous people by adopting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The Ministry of Sport and Community Development, which now has as part of its portfolio the management of issues related to First Peoples, continues to do its part to ensure compliance with the convention and the advancement of strategies consistent with the national development goals, the national policy on sustainable community development as they relate to the development of the First Peoples community. While COVID-19 and the realignment of the ministry may have impacted the time frame to achieve some of the plans developed by and for indigenous people, but nevertheless, we are pleased to share what was done and what we are doing in terms of those plans. The ministry's role has revolved around work with the registered First Peoples groups to discuss their current activities, future priorities, and the possibilities for partnership with government as well as facilitating the realization of the model Amerindian village pursuant to Cabinet Decision of 2009. We know that while the Ministry of Sport has a specific mandate for issues relating to First Peoples, the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and the Arts is also responsible for culture and cultural organizations. And so accordingly, that ministry continues to facilitate cultural education, recognition, and inclusion of the ways of life of First Peoples and the safeguarding of their cultural heritage. So we look forward to responding comprehensively to the interests of the committee, as well as to continuing the dialogue with various registered First Peoples groups to support their current activities and future priorities. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ms. Donovan Knights. I would like to call on Ms. Avril Belfond for a brief opening remarks.
Good morning again to all, and thank you, Chair. The National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago is a division, as we said before, of the Office of the Prime Minister, which is we are charged with two major responsibilities: to acquire, preserve, and provide public access to our nation's documentary heritage, that is, records that have been deemed to have long-term national, historical, and cultural significance. We are also responsible for guiding public records policy and management of practices so as to strengthen good governance, transparency, accountability, and efficiency. For the purposes of today's discussion, we are focusing on the first mandate. I'm so sorry, this other side though. Apologies. Additionally, it should be noted that the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago is not the only national government or government institution with responsibility for heritage preservation. Other agencies deal with different aspects of our heritage. For example, the National Trust would deal with built and natural heritage. National Museum would be more focused on artifacts and objects, and the National Library with published works, etc. The National Archives, therefore, can answer questions and issues related to its own role and does not presume to speak for the entire government interaction with the First Peoples. But having said that, of course, we at the National Archives are committed to building an inclusive collection which will document the diverse cultures of the peoples of our nation. We collect mainly primary sources of history and unpublished works such as files, manuscripts, original recordings, etc. And we work diligently to ensure that they are authoritative and reliable sources which have been vigorously verified. These documents then serve as the basis for research and scholarship by students, historians, private citizens, etc. We facilitate this research by providing access to these documents in our publicly accessible search room and online via our website, social media, and an email reference service. And we stand ready to answer and provide any information necessary to support the availability of documentation or records that would help and guide this process. And thank you for having us.
Many thanks, Ms. Avril Belfond. I now call on Mr. Ricardo Barath Hernandez, who is the Chief and President of the Santa Rosa First Peoples Community.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity to say these opening remarks in this very special and what we consider to be very important meeting. We are happy that it is finally on, because it was since probably about 3 years or more that we first had notification to appear before a joint select committee, and for one reason or the other, it did not materialize until today. So we thank God and we thank you all for facilitating and making sure that this process is on. Let me begin by saying that the indigenous peoples of Trinidad existed here from pre-colonial times, as I know that all of us would know through our history and so on. But it was only in 1990, May of 1990, that the Santa Rosa First Peoples community was recognized by the government of the day through our cabinet as the representative voice of the First Peoples of Trinidad and Tobago. And that was so because at that time, there was no other organization, indigenous organization in the country. Subsequent to that, we have had coming on board, and I imagine it is through the work of the Santa Rosa First Peoples that the people in the country had become more aware, and then people of indigenous descent in other parts had begun to identify with their indigeneity and started organizing themselves. And so we had other groups being formed and being registered as legal entities. Having said that, I would like to say that since that time, successive governments have taken steps to improve the plight of the First Peoples. When we got the first government recognition, a cabinet-appointed committee was appointed. But at that time, that committee never met because the people who were named to that committee were very high-profile members of the government and we could have never had the opportunity to get a quorum. So that just died a natural death. After some years, we continued to lobby, and we had a committee in place and we started to work. So that successive governments have made contributions to the upliftment and the visibility of our First Peoples. Having said that, we feel at times that it is that we are placed at the same level and looked at as another cultural group in the society. And we feel that indigenous people should be looked at through different lenses. The United Nations Declaration clearly states of certain rights of indigenous peoples, which we are not saying that makes them different or not different, but more important than the other sectors. We are all important equally. But when you come to the indigenous communities, we are supposed to be looked at and treated in a slightly different manner because of the ingenuity and the inherent rights of our indigenous peoples.
Many thanks, Mr. Hernandez. Really a good introduction, and I'm hoping for more of an input from you when the questions start. I would just like to get the Grand Chief of the Warao Nation to give a 2-minute introduction as well.
I have put a lot of the Warao people must give information. How high then?
So I am Rabina Shah, as I said, spokesperson for the Warao Nation. What Tella is trying to say is that our tradition, which we would like you to pay respect to as we pay respect unto yours, gives permission to the spokesman from the elders council to speak on behalf of the Warao Nation. That's what the brother is trying to say. Now, sir, I'm a little disturbed to see that the Parliamentary Joint Select Committee statement of intent is human rights and equality. That's supposed to be, in my view, the term of reference, is to establish whether the state of Trinidad and Tobago is delivering justice unto indigenous peoples, i.e. the Warao Nation and the First Peoples of Arima. The human rights of indigenous peoples or nations is the question before this Parliamentary Joint Select Committee. Whether the state is meeting and treating with indigenous people and nations in full compliance with the human rights law is one part of this committee's inquiry, in our opinion. However, it appears that the committee has deferred from this position. The other part is whether there is equality in respect to the treatment of indigenous peoples or the First Nations in human rights law. See? So the question arises, as to the right of sovereignty or the status with respect to the Aboriginal sovereign territories, now defined or recognized as Trinidad and Tobago, a member state of the United Nations. So we would like to make a statement concerning our status. We are the original nation, the original First Nation of this land. And if you look at evidence from the book Johannes Wilbert, Mystic Endowment, there's evidence there to support, our claim. We have submitted claims to the past governments for 11 years now. Claim number 1 with respect to Nabarima Hill or San Fernando Hill, which is our cosmological world, Earth gods, the northern end. This comes under Article 18 of the Human Rights Law. Under Article 17, it speaks to the right of indigenous people to property. Under Article 15, it speaks to the right of indigenous people's nationality. It appears to us that this inquiry is not in keeping with the law that the statement of intent implies. So we would just like to put this before this Joint Select Committee, because it appears to me that this is ultra-virus law.
Many thanks for your contribution and introduction, and we definitely hope that your opinion will change from the discussions, because we do adhere primarily to the guidelines of the UN for the purpose of this Joint Select. And I believe after the meeting, we can alleviate your concerns and we can move forward in recognition, and in addition to recognition of your nations as first occupier as best as possible. I now welcome questions by the committee. And in lieu of the topics that you have just mentioned, sir, I would like to have Member Scotland lead the discussions with his first question. Member Scotland.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning to the First Peoples. Mr. Rabiha Shah, good morning.
Yes, good morning.
I am not surprised as to the very sterling and very passionate plea from Mr. Shah. I can assure you that he is well schooled in areas of the law. He had a very good ally some years gone by, and I will not disclose anything further. May I start by asking the First Peoples on both the Santa Rosa and the Waro Nation, and we are here about solutions. What are your suggestions that the government can bring to the table in order to augment or improve the preserving of the cultural heritage of the indigenous people, the first people of Trinidad and Tobago? Can I start with Santa Rosa, Mr. Shah, then can I come up across to you after?
Many thanks. I was now going to suggest that question. Please go across to Mr. Shah, and then after the Warao Nation subsequently. Thanks for the question, Mr. Scotland. Mr. Shah first, and then followed by
Mr. Shah is the Warao Nation. Mr. Fernandez, he is the First People.
Correct. So
we'll go the First People of Arima, Santa Rosa.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much again, Mr. Chair, for the question, and I will try to answer as best as we see it. And if I understand it correctly, is what can the government do to ensure the preservation and the success of the First Peoples? I speak for Santa Rosa First Peoples community. And Santa Rosa First Peoples community have been lobbying for many, many years for lands to re-establish a space, an indigenous space. After they lost 1,320 acres of land, which was given as the inalienable property in Arima, and that was lost under the British. Recently, in just the last few years, the government have made 25 acres of land available to the Santa Rosa First Peoples community under a lease agreement. We are saying that to do a lease for Indigenous peoples is an insult to Indigenous peoples. That land should never be a lease, but it should be a grant. And if it had to be a lease of not more than 90 or 99 years, I think. This lease is for 30 years. That is not acceptable. That is number one.
Right. So not cutting you. So the first point you are saying is the land is an issue, and although land has been allocated, you do not like the title of the land, and that it's a 30-year lease, and it should at least be a 99-year lease. Yes. This committee will try to be practical, so we want practical. What is your second suggestion, sir?
My second suggestion is that all the efforts that are being made to highlight and to preserve the Indigenous people's way of life, their culture and their heritage needs to have some substantial foundations. For instance, we had asked for a one-off holiday many years ago, which we got. But we are seeing now that as that holiday is gone, that the day comes as a day of recognition and people are not aware, and that support as the other major ethnic groups have in the country to sustain their culture, to give a day of recognition where the whole country recognizes and support is not there. So we are like, swimming against the tide. We need a day, a public holiday, as the rest of the ethnicities, where we can focus on Indigenous issues and get that support. And if not a full holiday, but a day of significance, not just a day of recognition. And the third thing I would like to say is to see that a team be put in place to fast track the development of our heritage village, which will, support all that we are doing and give people a sense of pride and belonging. And that is lagging on too long, too many obstacles. We need a special technical team to fast track that and to see how we can get that going.
Many thanks for your contribution, sir. All points taken and noted. You do have my support when it comes to recognizing that day. It was a wonderful day. I was in Arima myself on that day. It was, I believe, it was in 2017, and the festivities and the foods and the cultural display was amazing. And I personally support if it is that the holiday, unlike that day, and the recognition can move forward. Thank you very much.
Chairman, can we get the response from the Waru Nation, please?
Yes, the same response from the Waru Nation. Member Scotland, after those two particular responses, I would like just to jump across to the communication arm of the PM's office to see, if it is that the last contribution with respect to the support, and what can they do to push this forward and to support the wants. Okay, so a member from the Waru Nation.
Mr. Scotland, members of this honorable committee, with respect to cultural contributions and recognition of cultural contributions, this is but a part of our tradition. And how could we contribute culturally without, for example, our intellectual property per se being protected? So that for the government to put the emphasis on cultural contributions, which speaks more to the arts and that sort of thing, agriculture and so on, is defeating the very purpose of recognizing our rights. Because if our rights are not recognized, how could we contribute? Suppose we give part of our agricultural experience and so on, or knowledge. What guarantee we have that we would be financed to make this into a viable business that could support our peoples? So, or is it that this cultural contribution is going to be used by the people with capital and exploit our intellectual property for their value and leave us in the rain as usual. You see, after 11 years of meeting and treating with the governments, both governments, PNM and People's Partnership, nothing has been offered to us. Everything has been offered to Santa Rosa. So we have a black sheep, it appears. This is inequality. This is why we thought that, the direction of this committee would stick to the law. But it's unfortunate, as I've said, that we go ultra-virus the law and into the government's agenda, which is suspect, in our view.
Before Mrs. Scotland, you have to recognize what I did and said, sir, in your previous contribution, that we are progressing and the whole purpose of this inquiry is to get your point of view so that we can move forward in taking your recommendations forward. I've firstly heard the cultural contribution. Is there in the recognition of the cultural contribution, is there anything else you would like to raise?
Well, we would like to be allowed to make our cultural contributions from a perspective where we can do it. It's a practical thing to us. And without finances and this sort of thing and our territories and so on, we are left, with nothing in our hands to work with.
Understood, but what do you see as a starting point? You mentioned that you felt as if there was not recognition for yourselves and the other organization got recognition. What would be a good starting point on behalf of your community, sir?
Yes, we would think that we could be on equal par with the others who have got lands and so on. But we reject the idea of leasing our lands to us. So we think that if we should get a parcel of land, probably 100 acres, as the case may be, to enter into cultural contributions practically, then we could now share this within the community at large. We'd also need the financial assistance to put this into operation.
So similar to the last contributor, you would like to have some comforts. You would like to have some comfort of some sort of location and also a task force assigned to push the business of your community forward so that you can be recognized, and also, in addition to being recognized, that your people could be the center point of the location where you may benefit from it on a social, cultural, and economic manner?
Yes, you put it in perspective.
Right.
The question of ownership of this exercise.
Yes.
Of controlling this exercise. This we want to be established in our domain.
Okay. No, listen and understood, sir. Thank you for your contribution. Mr. Scotland, would you like to make a follow-up, or shall we go to the communication division of the Prime Minister's office?
Chairman, I think the follow-up will apply both to the two indigenous groups that are represented, two indigenous peoples groups that are represented here, and also the office of the Honorable Prime Minister. I want to ask, Chairman, through you, what do you think can be done? So we are piggybacking on what government can do, but what can both First Peoples nations do, and the governments, I'm asking this also the government representative, to sensitize the country and by extension the world to our First Peoples heritage? And I want suggestions, please.
I would like to pass that question primarily over to the communications division of the office of the Prime Minister, and see if the both indigenous groups would be in agreement with. and support of what they may be able to be in support of. OPM, Communications Division.
Okay, good day again, Chair. Thank you. I just want to be sure that I'm answering the question that is posed. It is really, what can we do to help to sensitize both the country and the world about the contribution of the First Peoples in Trinidad and Tobago?
And the cultural heritage that they bring with them.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to, as again I said before, we're speaking specifically to our role as the National Archives and what we do as to collect and ensure that we have documents related to the history and the story and the work, everything about the persons of all the groups in Trinidad and Tobago. It is our mandate, and we have continued to do it, to try to collect and ensure that the material is available at the National Archives. But far beyond having it available, we have worked together with both communities right here, both Chief Barrett as well as the members of the Rao, I'm sorry, I'm saying it correctly, to a lesser extent, yes, truthfully, and have collaborated and worked with them in terms of promoting activities that they've had, supplying information, what is available at the National Archives already. We've had both exhibitions in-house as well as online on our various social media platforms. We have those exhibitions and those products that we have produced. We don't only have it at our archives or online, we consciously go out to communities, schools, and so on, so that the information is promoted on a wide forum. But one of the main issues that we would like to point out is that a lot of the content, the material, because again with the National Archives, the material that we've collected is mainly material coming out of the work of the government. The material, the content would be documents that had come from since the advent of the colonial powers. And as Chief Barrett mentioned, of course the First Peoples have existed here for much longer than that. And what is documented will be, for the most part, that interaction between those two groups, so that we will get some material coming out of the Spanish or the British and so on, what is documented about that interaction. What is missing, and I think, and I want to say it on this forum, that would be, I think, a great contribution for us as heritage professionals and, of course, in the government, that there needs to be some support for the work of archaeology, which I think will add a lot more, and I think Chief and the Rara could bear me out, and of course our professors, that there's a lot of material, a lot of information to be had from looking for supporting and building on archaeological work. There's a lot of more information to be learned about the work, the culture, the history and the story of our indigenous people from that. But having said that, on our part of the National Archives, the records that we can access, we have been making efforts with the Spanish archives, which is the archives in Seville, to retrieve the original records, which are not here at our National Archives. They remain with the Spanish government when they left. And so there have been efforts made by the archives through both the Spanish embassy and in direct contact with the Seville archives to reacquire those records. And in the documents we submitted to the committee, we have listed some of the more important ones. It's not all, but some of the ones that we identified from their catalogs, which would certainly speak to information about lands and how a relationship that the First Peoples would have had during their interaction with that first encounter with the Spanish when they came to our region. So on our end, I think it would be very important that that is supported in trying to acquire that information and make sure it's available, so to facilitate scholarship by peoples in Trinidad and Tobago, and of course to provide additional information to support the various claims that are being made by the First Peoples here. We have tried to put forward, and we have put forward, I should say, a project under our development program to because we do not have funds necessary just to acquire. And these agencies are not giving us for free. We have to purchase these records. So we have put forward a PSIP project to deal with the acquisition of these original records.
Ms. Belfon, thank you very much for your very well-weighted and informative contribution. I would like to suggest at this point in time, I mean, you did mention that you have community outreach, but based upon, Mr. Ford, I'll come to you immediately after, based upon what you have in possession, and when it comes to archives and what has been brought to the archives division, I would like to just suggest at this point in time that the First Peoples and the Warao community be given the opportunity, just in passing a way forward, be given the opportunity when there is the awareness campaigns coming up, when it is the outreach programs that you may do, to bring them in, not just to vet, but to vet and to contribute. We speak a lot of archives and past, but there's nothing past relics, and they are tangible. But one of the most important intangible tangibles is experience from people. And everyone in front of us today, from all the First communities and the Warao Nation, they have, I'm sure, a wealth of information, and they would love to have their perspective brought forward, especially as it comes to outreach in the future. Member Ford, you had a contribution?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations on your elevation to the chairmanship this morning. And as we go forward, good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. Esmond Ford here. I would just like to put together a certain perspective from both the Santa Rosa First Peoples community and the Warao Nation community in terms of, you all hear me?
Loud and clear, sir. Loud and clear.
Right. Okay. Yes. You know, I would just like a perspective from these both two indigenous groups in terms of the numbers, you know, that we are dealing with. When I say in terms of the population amount of these both groups, so that our country, Trinidad and Tobago, can get a clear perspective based on the terms that, you know, they are seeking land, they are seeking public holidays, they are seeking a technical team in order to fast track the indigenous village. We are hearing that rights not being recognized. We are hearing, you know, no funding, no recognition. Because why I'm asking this is that, remember, we need to take into consideration other groups coming forward at a later date saying the same thing. We entitled to this, we are not entitled to this. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you all are not entitled, but I would just like to get a perspective in terms of the numbers we are talking about, the population base of these two groups, Mr. Chairman, so that, you know, we can be clear in going forward, which will also give us a greater perspective in making our recommendations as we go forward, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Noted, Member Ford. Can I get any responses from the Mr. Ricardo Barras, followed by the Grand Chief of the Warao Nation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Excellent question. In terms of numbers, we at our local level have numbers. In the Arima and environs, it's numbers about 6,000 descendants of our First Peoples. That is not taken into consideration people of indigenous descent throughout Trinidad, throughout the country. We lobbied, one of the things we had lobbied for in one of the cabinet appointed committees was for inclusion in the national census, for category in the national census for people to identify as indigenous or Amerindian. And we were successful in getting that lobby adhered to, in that the last census we had, a category was included for people to claim their indigeneity. But what happened is that the education was not there. So that when the census went out, you find that people weren't aware to claim, their indigenousness under that census. So that they still continue to register under other and so on. And the percentage that is in the last census is very small. So that if there is another census, we need to educate the people here. There is a category. Another thing I want to say on that is that we had a DNA testing out of a team from the University of Pennsylvania, who first did that project among members of our community. And what they found was amazing, to see the percentage of the indigenous blood flowing in those people who are of indigenous descent. And then they went out further into the community, into the wider community. And there were a number of people in the community who don't even know that they are of indigenous descent that found that the percentage of their DNA very high in terms of the indigenous. So what I think is needed to get an accurate figure is in the next census, a clear marker and education to follow so that people can claim, and we can have a better picture, a better idea rather, than how many of people of indigenous descent in the country.
Thank you so much, Mr. Barras. Can I have, Mr. Ford, I was now coming to you, back to you, to ask a particular question. From my understanding, on your question, you were not just speaking about the total volume of numbers in a community, but you were speaking about the possibility of new communities emerging, were you?
Well, no. You see, I'm looking from the point of view of both the Santa Rosa First People and the Ruawa. What are their total numbers?
Very well, very well.
Mr. Barrett Hernandez mentioned 6,000, but as we know, there will be multiplication, there will be persons being born as we go forward. I just want to get a total picture of what sort of numbers.
And I like the fact that Mr. Barras spoke about the Philadelphia project when it came to DNA testing. I would like to, have the committee's indulgence in thinking along those lines so that we can make recommendations going forward as it applies to recognizing persons of indigenous genealogy. We have a hand, before we go to the Grand Chief, the professor has her hand up, and I'm sure it's going to be a little pertinent on the matter. Before you make your next point, Mr. Ford, I just would like to get Mr. Rosemary Antoine in on the action right now.
Thanks, and thank you so much for this meeting, so important. I just wanted to emphasize that cultural rights are important, but both Barra and Santa Rosa are saying more land and livelihoods, and that is in fact supported in international law principles. And just to assure Mr. Ford that it does not apply to other groups, because these rights are unique and specific to indigenous peoples, and they have actually entitlements, including property rights, and it's been upheld all over the world, including in the Caribbean, Belize, most recently Guyana, Dominica, as the case may be. And in the case of our First Peoples, it's not just because of the colonial history that we know about, the brutal history where all the lands, nobody's saying give back all the land to the First Peoples, no. But it's also what I think Chief was alluding to, that in the recent past, there's evidence of plain fraud and illegal misappropriation of land and the breach of agreements that the state set up and the church set up, like in Aruma, Rima, perhaps San Fernando. So and Minister Scotland will understand this. So we have two sets of injustices, and I think we should start to think about the term reparations in relation to First Peoples, especially in relation to land. And the last point I want to make, and I think Chief has talked about the 25 acres not being enough. We don't want leases. Wara has said leases. I agree. It shouldn't be leases. It should be outright grants of land. But there's one last thing I wanted to say, and that right now we are talking about climate smart strategies to protect against climate change and so on. And I actually believe that the First Peoples have an important role to play to help the entire nation because of their own religious and cultural traditions, which have always preserve the environment. They emphasize that. So we have a lot to learn from them as custodians of the land. So if we can give them the tools and resources, including the IP protections, including some finance, to fulfill that role, I think it benefits the entire nation. So we probably should look at it from that point of view, not just some favor, but an entitlement one. So I just wanted to throw that in. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Back to you, Mr. Ford.
Right. Again, and I still want to hear from the Rawa Grand Chief also with regards to his numbers. And a follow-up question one time, Mr. Chair. These two groups, these two indigenous groups, right? They are seeking holidays, they are seeking land, they are seeking recognition. Is there any possibility that they can be considered as one grouping?
Mr. Ford, let me just straighten up. Was one thing, it's not a matter of seeking a public holiday. They were just a day of recognition because they appreciated the holiday given back in 2017. It's a day of recognition where what was recognition, yeah.
Right. So therefore, can they be considered both indigenous groups that we are referring to today, right? Can they take whatever is being offered, whatever recommendation that comes out of our committee, right, to the various ministries, can it be considered, are they saying that they want separate recognition, or can be considered as one indigenous recognition for these groups?
Okay, before we move on to answering the first question, the second question, sorry, I would like to have the Grand Chief of the Warao Nation answer the first question first. We will then come back to the professor, who I'm sure would alleviate the culmination, speak about the culmination of the groups possibility, and then we would open the floor to the Mr. Barras to answer the second question in follow-up from Professor. The Grand Chief of the Warao Nation.
Yes, sir. With respect to the views of Mr. Ricardo Barr, the Chief from Arima, I think that he's sort of on spot, you know, and that idea of proof of indigenousness is very important, because the thing that the gentleman is saying there, you know, perhaps if we don't deal with that effectively, according to the chief himself, Tom, Dick, and Harry will come and say this while when things change. You see, so that so that with regards to the numbers, right, of our people per se throughout Trinidad and Tobago, we believe that this numbers is in the hundreds of thousands. You know, because you have to understand our history. 3,000 years ago, we actually had a treaty, an oral treaty, with the people that history called the Arawaks, the Lukuno people. As a result of that treaty, they have lived in our territory, and we've become a sort of a, I don't need to call it cosmopolitan is the right word or what, but we become integrated, you know, as families there. 2,000 years ago, the Karina, or the so-called Karens, came, and the same thing happened. We had a treaty with them. See? So we have to understand that we are the protectors of the treaty-bound nations under our protection. You see, so that this whole thing about trying to divide, or the gentleman spoke about trying to unite, which is great, but we've got to know the true history, right? And even the question of DNA, for instance, to identify a person, the very specialist in the DNA department is saying quite clearly, we can't determine who's a Warao from who's a Karina or who's a Arawak. So then where's the purpose of that? I think that the question that a lady alluded to earlier, that we get the archives from Spain, this will give us an idea of our family history. And then we can go through the archives in the legal ministry and follow up this to more or less identify the true owners, you know, or the true indigenous people. As I said, more than 100,000 Warao people are in Trinidad. Some don't even know that they are Warao, as the professor indicated. See, and you know, to kind of equate, you know, I mean, yes, we're talking about equality, but remember that the original owner of the land is distinct to the people who came into his land. You see, and to sort of equate them, you know, you have to look at the law of status. Status speak to, not to all persons, it speak to particular persons. According to let me try and read this for you in this document. Status is a person's legal condition, personal or proprietary, the sum total of that person's legal right. Refers or applies to specific individuals as opposed to everyone. Free person. This is something very particular. Father and the rights of original son of the soil to his parents' inheritance. See? So that law of trust is the issue here. Due to the modern tendency towards equality, status has become less frequent or has diminished. So honor thy father and mother or ancestors related to sovereignty of their national status as successors with the right to self-determination. And all this is not being considered by the state. So we're looking at this thing from a keyhole, rather than opening the door to see the real picture.
Thank you very much for that point. And I believe in your explanation, you've managed to answer the second part of the question about how you may feel about the grouping aspect. Yes, so many thanks for your contribution. Professor Antoine, any words on the topic at hand?
Yes, I think Mr. Ford's question is very pertinent, and it is likely that we could end up with two main groupings, yeah? But just to point out that this is not an abstract exercise in terms of law. You have to use anthropological evidence. This is what we did in Belize, in the Mayan Alliance, to prove a whole host of things, including occupation and history and etc. So, and I think Santa Rosa, that's why they started that, DNA evidence and so forth. So it is possible that you could get two main groupings, but I don't think you're going to get like 100 groupings. Most would fall into the two main groupings, so you may have to consider two sets of resources for two separate peoples. I think the state should be aware of that. It is possible that could happen.
Many thanks. And any other line of questioning? Oh, I do apologize. I did promise to go to Mr. Barath now. Just his answering of the second question in follow-up to the last three contributions.
Yes, thank you so much, Chair, once again. On the question I think Mr. Ford raised about if they're looking for separate recognition, I think in terms of there are areas that the groups can agree on, and there are areas where we see things differently as any other section of the society. For instance, the groups we may have our different agendas, and how we want to pursue that and what we feel is justified by the state to us, we may see that approach differently by the other groups may see it differently. But in terms of a national recognition, I think we can come together and agree on that, in that all groups, it is for indigenous peoples, and all groups can fall under that day of recognition or holiday or whatever it is, and we can develop our programs, under that. Because those in the South will do things in the South, those in the North will do things in the North, and it will benefit the whole country. So there are areas, yes, where we can agree, and there are areas that we see things differently. And there is precedent set by Canada for this. And Canada in their documentation deals with their diverse indigenous groups case-by-case basis.
Well, thank you so much, especially for raising up the Canadian point. I really are appreciative of that. Mr. Ford, one final comment for you on this topic, because I really would like to go on to the Ministry of Sport. Seeing... Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
You see, it's based on the last comment that that Chief Barrett Hernandez has now made, where he's making reference to the other countries, like for instance, Canada. So, and this is why I wanted the whole perspective in terms of numbers, percentages, so that we can clearly determine how we are going to go forward with regards to this. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Point noted, sir. Can I move on to the Ministry of Sport, Youth and Culture, please? And as it pertains to the questioning so far for the morning, what are your thoughts on the matter? What are the programs, and what do you do in the purview of these topics for the community and the nation to hear as a whole?
Hi, thanks again, Donovan Knights, speaking on behalf of the Ministry of Sport. I just wanted to bring to the attention of the committee and the people of Trinidad and Tobago that the cabinet in providing the land through the Santa Rosa First Peoples community intended that that site would have been for all of the First Peoples as a grouping. So that's one thing to take note of, and I guess one has to be clear whether there is the feeling that that should be changed, or how do we treat with that? But we do have a cabinet decision that puts forward the 25 acres, the land in Arima, as something, as a model Amerindian village that benefits all of the First Peoples of Trinidad and Tobago. And I think that that point needs to be made. Earlier, there was a question of what is being done for to promote the value and the recognition of the First Peoples in Trinidad and Tobago and around the world. And it must be pointed out that the government of Trinidad and Tobago over the years has given funding via the Santa Rosa First Peoples community to host activities to mark the International Day of the World's Indigenous People, to mark the Day of Recognition in October, to conduct workshops and educational activities so that the citizens at large could be informed about the history, the practices, the culture, and so on of Indigenous persons. So there is support, through the Santa Rosa First Peoples. And as was said at the beginning, the other groups, there was not a focus on the other groups because Santa Rosa at the time would have been the first and the duly registered entity. The ministry has been in talks between 2017 and 2019 with the other groups, the two Warao Nation groups, the Moruga group, and the Partners for Development, in terms of trying to understand what would their interests be and how the ministry could support their interests. What we have not received would be clear proposals from these groups in terms of written proposals in terms of what they would want and how the ministry could support. But there's a lot of discussion going on, and the ministry does stand ready to support, in addition to which there are several other government grant facilities where the First Peoples community can take advantage of opportunities to showcase their work and so on.
Thanks for that contribution. Can I just interject here and ask a question to you, Ms. Donovan, followed also for our answer to Ms. Belfon? I would like to know of any thrust on behalf of these indigenous groups. I would like to know if there exists any thrusts in incorporating these indigenous teachings and practices through the primary and secondary school curriculum as it applies for them being our First Peoples and Indigenous peoples, and if there has been any level of engagement to enhance our educational curriculum in recognition of these people.
Well, please let me say that as part of I wouldn't really want to answer on behalf of the Ministry of Education, but I do know that there was work done in terms of introducing and documenting and even revising the history of the Indigenous peoples definitely on the books in terms of the status. I couldn't say right now, but I know, and I don't know if Ms. Belmontes would wish to comment, but certainly efforts were made in the past to, one, look at the history of the indigenous people and ensure that that was available in terms of the education, the Ministry of Education, as well as documentation that would have been made available or was supposed to be made available to the education system.
Mr. Chairman, can you advise what I can do to get your attention?
You can raise your hand, but since you have it on, but since you have it already, you can take the floor.
Yes, because it was raised 3 times and it was lowered by some electronic interception.
I do apologize. I have no control over that. Senator, I look forward to your contribution.
Thank you very much, sir. I would just start with the preamble to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, where it says that concern that indigenous peoples have suffered from historic injustices as a result of, inter alia, their colonization and dispossession of their lands, territories, and resources, thus preventing them from exercising, in particular, their right to development in accordance with their own needs and interests. And this feeds into Article 26 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which says, indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. Now, when I look at the First Peoples submission, it seems to me that they are happy with the 25 acres that they have received, but what they're not happy about is the method of ownership, in that they have a lease rather than outright ownership. But when I looked at the other group, where they say we are privy to information where 147 acres of land is being purchased by members of the corporate sector in Trinidad and Tobago at $42 million, yet we as a nation are not in possession of any land owned by our ancestors. Foreign systems have divided us into individuals with the concept of human rights, equality, and diversity, and the United Nations has not recognized any indigenous nation as a member. So I get a sense that they are not at all satisfied with what has happened with them in terms of the land. But I'm not sure what exactly they want in terms of the land. If they want to own the land, if they want their community to come together and occupy those lands, which way they will have a captive group where they can pass on their cultures and so on. I recall going to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and seeing all the indigenous people gathered there together. We were able to go and shop and, buy things from them, recognizing that that was their place, that you could meet with these indigenous people. I remember also going up the Essequibo River in Guyana and meeting with the indigenous people there and chatting with them around the time of Carifesta. So they have a place where they can call their own. Is it that what the indigenous people in Trinidad and Tobago are striving for? Is it that they want, a place that they say, well, this is mine, this is ours? And is it that we're saying that there is unity in strength? And if we're dealing with the First People, and it's instructed, but they are called the First People, and they are not the only First People, as opposed to the other group, is it that we're saying come together, and perhaps what we get from the ministry is that it was for everybody, that is what's going to happen? What do they want, really? Are they going to come together, or are they saying, well, look, we are a group, and we are independent of any other group, and we want what is due to us as people who are not named First People, but are First People?
Point noted, Senator. I would like to, I think part of your question was already answered when the representative of the Warao Nation spoke. And I would like to ask the question now, what is the plan moving forward? Because when he did speak, he spoke about the DNA, the DNA can tell you who's Warao, but it can't tell you which Warao they are. So it puts everything in a muddle. I am asking him, what would their plans be moving forward in support of your question, Senator? Is that okay?
That's fine, sir.
Right. Subsequent to that, I would like to have the inputs of both ministries into Senator Thompson I's a line of questioning as it applies to the governance, which I saw even coming with applause and nods from both indigenous groups, from all here on the screen. I would like to hear their perspective on the UN perspective, and maybe after that we can get some comments from Ms. Haynes, who I believe would like to make a comment or two. Any matter, Mr. the representative from the Warao Nation.
Yes, sir. You see, again, we're falling back into the status of a nation. Right? And you keep calling us a community, and we are not a community. We are the original owners of these lands, historically. We are the Warao Nation. Perhaps I should read to you in law what is a nation. You see? In law, a nation is defined as a large group of people having common origin. Common origin suggests from creation kind of thing. Common language and common tradition. Let's speak of culture here. Usually constituting a political entity and territory. So we're defining who we are. This territory belongs to us. Under the very Treaty of Amiens, which had a secret clause, that Spain gave Trinidad and Tobago onto the English or the United Kingdom, is not constitutional, is not part of international law. But international law began some years ago, 1538 to be precise. And I don't want to go into it right now because I have to look for it and that sort of thing. But what I'm saying is that the concept of consent, the concept of agreement speaks to a treaty. And this is what we are talking about. But you're running from this and talking about cultural contributions as if Trinidad and Tobago own us. Our status there, sir, gives us the status of free persons. We are not under the jurisdiction of the state. And this is not
point taken, sir. Can we move on to the next contributioners plan, which is the ministries, Office of the PM, and also the Ministry of we will start with Ministry of Sport, Youth and Culture. Ministry of Sport and Community Development, please.
Thank you. So the ministry looks forward, and while we understand the comments by both groups, both nations, we look forward to greater cohesion among all of the representatives of groups of the First Peoples in Trinidad and Tobago, so that notwithstanding the variations and diversity that may exist among the groups, there could be national consensus on the aspirations of the First People community, so that government's continued and future investment in the community could reflect a shared vision among the First Peoples representatives. We look forward to the involvement of all First Peoples communities in the design and configuration of, and I have to say, either the model Amerindian village or model Amerindian villages, if that is what is preferred by the community, in keeping with the spirit and intention of the government. It must be noted that the collective involvement of the ARIMA in the ARIMA model village does not negate the possibility of development, promotion, and safeguarding of other special sites around the country. All right, and while recognizing the priority prioritizing collaboration among the representing organization of First Peoples, the ministry is still very open to welcoming proposals from the 4 representing organizations. The ministry also recognizes that considerable investment has been made by the state and the Santa Rosa First Peoples community towards the development of a model Amerindian village. This 25-acre model Amerindian village, intended to be a cultural and heritage center for all First Peoples of Trinidad and Tobago, but also has the potential to be a considerable and prominent site for local and international tourism. Given the potential value of this investment, in the first instance, our precious First Peoples, to the economy of Arima, as well as to all of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, the ministry is of the view that considerable care needs to be taken in the building of the village. The ministry therefore recommends that the construction of the model Amerindian village be placed in the hands of a state enterprise under the guidance of the Santa Rosa First Peoples community and all of the representative organizations of First People. This will ensure that all of the relevant approvals and feasibility studies could be obtained and a clear phased development approach be outlined. I think those are some of the main concerns. The ministry is of the view that, and we would want to recommend that the relevant legal Ministry of Attorney General, look into the question of the nature of the title for the land in terms of the lease versus grant situation. I think those would be our main issues. We also would want to recommend the reconvening or the convening of multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral committee, as has spearheaded a lot of the work that has been done for the First People community since 1990. We would also want to recommend that we consider having such a committee reestablished so that it can both continue the great work that has been done in the past and further work for the recognition and addressing some of the issues of the rights that have been raised by the First Peoples community. Thank you.
Ministry, thank you so much. I'm seeing a few nods while the contribution is going forward, but I'm also seeing some frowns. Let me get Ms. Belfon in to have a word, and I would like a response, a brief response from the Indigenous and First Peoples groups before we move on to Ms. Haynes. Just by a nod, Mr. Senator, has your questions been answered?
Yes, but I do have further questions follow up because it's important.
Yes, I understand.
About getting people together.
Yes, I understand that part, but I just wanted to, based upon your first line of questioning, I would like to have Ms. Belfon have a word. I'm seeing, are you raising your hand, Mr. Are you raising your hand, Mr. Donis? No, so Ms. Belfon, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of the contributions that the National Archives can assist or support in this process, I'd just like to reiterate that our role then is that support, facilitation, and education. And we stand ready to provide that support to all groups. It is and has always been our mandate at the National Archives to highlight the history of all communities, members of the nation or nations, however they identify themselves. And again, just to reiterate, coming from your previous comment, it is not only the written record, but definitely we also do support oral histories, documenting of activities, performances, any way that your or anyone's culture is recorded, all of that is part of the work that we do and is included. Specifically, I would say that what we can immediately contribute, and I would say as a government, we could support, it's a suggestion, the facilitation of the acquisition, or if we would like to say the repatriation of some of our records related to, related to everyone, of course, but specifically to our First People that are housed outside of Trinidad and Tobago. As I said previously, we have made inroads, having discussion with the Spanish about it, and there may be some overlap even in terms of the British. However, it is a costly exercise and it is difficult. And it's been taking many years for us, it's negotiating and so on. But certainly, I think this is a way that we could contribute as a nation, as a government, if we facilitate and find ways to ensure that those records are here in Trinidad and Tobago to support access, research, and so that the First Peoples then would have the tools and the evidence to make their various claims. So I'm just suggesting that's one way that we could contribute. And secondly, in terms of education, I know you raised an issue of whether efforts have been made to highlight the culture and the First Peoples in primary and secondary schools. And as again, I've said, in terms of the work that we do, that this is ongoing. And it is work that we've not done on our own. I think Chief Barrett could bear us out. We've done it in collaboration with the First Peoples, and we do have a direct and ongoing relationship with various, with the Ministry of Education and with schools directly to ensure that when we promote the records of the archives, promote the history of Trinidad and Tobago, we do, of course, include and promote in our outreach program the culture, the history, and the story of the First Peoples. Yes. I think that's all I have.
Many thanks. I'm seeing more nods on the indigenous side, the First Peoples side. So I will just pause to go across. Before entertaining any further questions, Miss Senator Thompson, I would like to, just ask MP Haynes for a contribution on today.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning again, all. I think our discussions this morning have been particularly fruitful, especially in highlighting the greater need for sensitization and education. I believe that the remit of this committee in terms of promoting equality and diversity, this discussion today showcases how important it is to give the First People group, the nations represented here today, space to articulate their experiences, their unique place in our history, and also in crafting the space in our future as Trinidad and Tobago. I noted in the submission from the Wara Nation that there was a request for the creation of a communication center which would improve the sensitization space. So in terms of my question, which would be directed to the Ministry of Community Development, Sports and Community Development, I would be looking at, in terms of as we focus on government allocation and government intervention, how closely are our interventions linked with the requests of the First People of the various nations? And are we looking at making targeted interventions? I also note the contribution of Ms. Belfon, and I think that the work that is being done there is exceptional, but if it is kept in a private space or the access is only to those with a particular interest, it will not benefit the nation as a whole. So I think the collaboration between the ministries of communication as well as the nations represented here would lead us to a much better space as we go forward. So I guess my question would be, how closely are we collaborating? Are the submissions from the Wara Nation in terms of communication centers and spaces for sensitization of their space within our country cemeteries' history and future, how have they been taken on board, and are there any challenges that's being faced by the ministry at this time in terms of this implementation? Thank you, Chairman.
I believe the floor is open to you, the Ministry of Sport and Community, on this.
Thank you, Chairman. The Ministry of Sport and Community Development works very closely with all of the First Peoples groups, all the groups that represent the First Peoples. And over the years, the requests that have been fulfilled and are still being fulfilled through annual subventions, especially through the Santa Rosa First Peoples community, are exactly what they would have asked for. In terms of the Warao Nation, there are no written submissions to the ministry from the nation in terms of what it wants. There were lots of discussions and conversations, but we are still awaiting written submissions that we could action, take to cabinet, and get approval, as would have been the case with the Santa Rosa First Peoples. Thank you.
Sure.
Just one quick follow-up.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Please. With respect to the absence of any written submission, I think we can all acknowledge that bureaucracy sometimes gets in the way of our progress. And is there any space then within the ministry to assist persons in getting these written submissions and translating the conversations into what is needed by the ministry? Because I mean, if anybody has a public sector background, you would be aware that this is a significant barrier sometimes in just crossing the T's and dotting the I's. So I mean, I would like to just use this space to advocate for maybe some assistance in getting the written submissions done. And I think we'll see progress in that regard, especially if that's just a line that needs to be crossed.
Even the written submissions, as it applies, getting the assistance there for the Warao Nation on their behalf it's important. Can I get? He has his hand up, not virtually, but he has had his hand up. Let me ask Mr. Barrett Hernandez for his comments on the topic.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Once again, I want to answer a few questions. I think it was the senator, I can't remember the name now, that asked about if we were satisfied with the land that we got. We weren't satisfied with the land, but we took it because we felt it was a start. We were too long in the wilderness wanting to do something, so we took it because it was a start. Let me quickly say, Mr. Pandey, Basdev Pandey, when he was Prime Minister, visited our center where we were dealing with the subject of land. I think it was on a special day. And he leaned to us and he asked us, how much land you all are looking for? And I said, 400 acres. And he jumped from his chair. And he said, why don't you all take the whole northern range? You see, because he did not understand the land and indigenous people. We weren't going to develop 400 acres of land, but we wanted forests because the forest plays an integral role in the culture of the First Peoples. That is a long discussion. We don't have time to go more on it. Anyway, on the issue of education, we lobbied in one of the committees that the school curriculum should include more on the First Peoples, and that was done. As a result, we have students at all levels visiting our center for lectures, for seeing the artifacts, for interacting with them so that they can be educated on the First Peoples for their school curriculum work. So that was done. The coming together of First Peoples, the First Peoples groups. As I said before, and I would like to reiterate, there are certain issues we see eye to eye on. There are certain issues we don't, and the coming together will be, if you insist on that, like forced assimilation, which the United Nations clearly talks about. It was forced assimilation that the colonials did to First Peoples that have them in the state that they are today. And no one should ask us to come together because we see things differently and we cannot get along on certain things. If you look at my brother there, Mr. Shah, who I have a lot of respect for, he is on a different agenda to Santa Rosa agenda. Santa Rosa's agenda is to preserve our culture in the space and in the scene that we are today. He is on a different, I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm not saying he's wrong with what he's projecting, but his focus is on something different. As a result, our coming together will not take us forward. Let us deal with each other on a case-by-case basis. Yes. I thank you at this time.
Points noted, but I believe in the wider concept of consultation. Everyone's point of view, separately and together, must be taken into consideration. As for the record,
if I may, just to say that originally the land was yes for First Peoples. That was a cabinet decision. That was subsequently corrected by another cabinet decision, which said that the lands of the 25 acres is specifically for use by the Santa Rosa First Peoples community.
Thank you. Senator Aye, followed by Mr. Ford.
If I may, it seems to me, having regard to all what the ministry officials say, that they want to do, you know, the collaboration and all of that, I think there is need also, what they didn't mention is mediation. Somebody needs to have some mediating role, you know, between or among the groups. I don't know how many groups there are. But I was very excited when, you know, they talk about the potential for culture, because there is a lot. I travel a lot, and I'm able to go to countries. You go to Cayman Islands, and they tell you, oh, you know, and you go and you see what is happening, you know, and you have an exposition, and you spend money, and you are able to see and enjoy the culture. That isn't easily available here. And so I would like to see collaboration among all the groupings, and also, you know, among other people in this part of the world. I don't know if the First People are aware, when I say, I mean all of the people, that Belize last year swore in as the country's first female and third Governor General, Froyola Zalam, an indigenous woman. And the acting Chief Justice for about a year now, and she's now, I think I heard this week they moved her to the Court of Appeal, is also an indigenous woman. So why can't you meet with the people in Belize as well, and other people in the Caribbean, and see putting all your heads together, what we can come up with? Because I really believe unity is strength, you know, and there is a lot that you can gain from hearing, you know, about the progress of other people. So that would certainly be my recommendation.
Thank you, Senator. I would like to recognize two people who I would like to make allowed to contribute. Firstly, we go to Member Ford, and then we go to Mr. Adonis directly after.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two things. The ministry, First City Ministry, I would like to know basically what created the decision and the recommendation by the ministry to recommend a 30-year lease, one, and also why 25 acres of land, right? So I'd like to get a feedback from the ministry. And I'd also like to get from Chief Barrett Hernandez. He just mentioned that when Honorable Prime Minister Basdeo Panday, sometime between 1995 to 2001, asked him how much acres he needed, he said 400. In 2022, does that figure still stand? Thank you.
Mr. Adonis, please.
Mabrika, greetings in the Caribbean way, Mr. Chairman, and to all who are taking part in this special event today. What I believe is escaping the mind of a lot of people is that they doesn't realize that our people, the indigenous people, it is not just like an ordinary best village group or cultural group. We have great respect for our Warao brothers and sisters, but I want the committee to understand that we have difference in our spiritual practices, differences in our way we do medicine, differences in a lot of our ways. So of course we can get together on a national level in a day of recognition or something like that, where we portray or display all of our arts and craft and so on. But in our group, in our day-to-day life and dealing, we have differences. And I am sure that the Warao people would bear me out on that. So I want the other group to understand that we are dealing with spirituality, we are dealing with way of curing our people, with the way we practice our way of preparing food. There is quite a lot of differences within our people. There is unity with us as indigenous people, whereby we are trying for people to recognize that we are asking to be more recognized within the bigger whole Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Adonis. But at the same time, I would like you to understand the country in which we live in, Trinidad and Tobago, where we have every creed and race has an equal place. So in this whole landscape of cultures in Trinidad and Tobago, tolerance and respect is due to all faiths and all denominations. I would like to just remind you that in our multicultural society, we have members of different faiths who have to have their meats a certain way. They have members of our faiths who pray as different manner, which is in total how should I put it, non-agreeable terms with other communities, and we do share space. So points taken. Everything what you said has been noted, and the spiritual aspects and the religious aspects, based upon the sharing of spaces, obviously will have to be taken into consideration. Can I have, keeping the floor open to anyone who would like to virtually raise their hand at this point? I'm seeing Thomas Isaac, I believe.
Mr. Chairman, my question has not been considered yet.
Yeah, Thomas Isaac. Am I addressing you now, Thomas Isaac?
Yes, you are.
Right. I know we are coming to the end of the discussion, and I'd just like to bring two perhaps not really new perspectives, but certainly underline very many of the things certainly Ricardo has been saying. The first is that I want to commend the government and the ministry agencies for convening this meeting. I think it's a tremendous initiative and at a very appropriate time in history. Up to the end of the 20th century, civilization was essentially Eurocentric. We demonized other cultures and so on. The 21st century, what we normally refer to as the postmodern times, is a radically different time. In the context of a globalization process, and now we recognize the value of every civilization, those that have passed, those that are present, those that are disappearing. And what people like Christo Adonis and Chief Ricardo are involved in is the preservation of the little that has been left of our Aboriginal culture, a culture that precedes Western European cultures and other people's cultures by centuries, if not millennia. Right? We're trying to retrieve that, and we are trying to incorporate it in our own totality, cultural totality here in Trinidad and Tobago. And that has significant intellectual and cultural advantages and benefits. And I think that's the first point I would want to emphasize. And the next one is that it strikes me that, you know, when you look at the Amerindian people, at the first people, say in the Arima area where I belong, they're not asking for anything individually. They're like every citizen conducting their affairs, going to their works, looking after their families, establishing their homes, and so on. So it is not at the individual level that people are looking for benefits and handouts and so on. I think the trust is a communal trust. It is a community of people that want to concentrate. And to my mind, this will only be fully actualized when we really have our Amerindian village. The Amerindian village will bring tremendous benefits. It will provide, first of all, there's a certain tangibility about a village. A lot of the things we are talking about sound sort of airy-fairy, you know, and idealistic. But it's the Amerindian village that will give tangibility to this project. You know, this will be a place, a work site for people, right? There will be a sense of belonging. there'll be the opportunity to restore something that has disappeared from our society for so very long. It will be an income earner. People have emphasized the educational benefits of it. It's going to be a pedagogical center, a local spot for local tourism, and a spot for international tourism. And people like Adonis and so on are talking about the wildlife restoration and the agricultural pursuits. And we are talking now of feeding ourselves, of food security. A lot of the original foods are virtually lost in this country. I don't remember when last I saw cassava bread anywhere, you know. And I grew up in the 1950s and 60s with things like that. So when you look at the project that the Arima community is involved in, it is a really very significant project to the entire national community. And I would want to see, before the passing of people like Cristo and Ricardo, I would want to see the realization of that project, that village in Arima, where school children are becoming in bus loads day after day to be educated. Where tourists will be leaving the cruise ships and coming up to witness what is happening here. One of the things about South America is that you have to go into the remote areas to see the Amerindian villages. We are 15 minutes from Piaco and just 1 hour from Port of Spain. And that will be available. The actual members of the community will be involved in that project in a very direct way. And I think that's what I would want to emphasize, you know.
Thank you, Mr. Isaac. Your words have been taken note of, and you have actually started our wind-up process by building up all those points in such a wide and very summative point of view. There's one last hand up, and before we go into closing, I would like to hear from the professor.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad I came after the last two speakers, Adonis and the delegate, because I just wanted to reiterate. So I'm tying with Mr. Ford's, again, useful question about why not 400 acres and why 25 acres. And although Chief said we didn't have time to go into the religion and so on, it's actually key. When I spoke earlier about the religious and spiritual beliefs that ground, let us say, their approach to the environment, that is why you would want 400 acres to want to preserve the forest and so the environment. And I mentioned climate change in today's context for the nation. So it's not just to have, not just cut down the trees and build a house. No, that's not what it is. So I think it's important for us to understand that the entitlements and the rights that exist under law, international law, and some people spoke of the beliefs and so on, is also connected to those religious and spiritual and cultural beliefs which are tied to the land. So when we ask the practical thing, how much land, which I am glad we've gotten to this point, we kind of understood it's not just 25 acres and so on. I would like us to keep that in mind. And again, thank you so much for this meeting, which has been very helpful.
Many thanks, Professor. Seeing that we have no more hands up, I would just like to make a round of summation and invite brief closing comments. Firstly, from Ms. Donovan of the Ministry of Sports and Community Development, then followed by Ms. Belfon of the Office of the Prime Minister, Archives and Communication. And lastly, we will have Mr. Barath, followed by the representative of the Grand Chief of the Waru Nation, Ms. Donovan.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for your team for having this very important discussion. Just to respond to a question raised by MP Ford, it would have been in 2011 when the government of Trinidad and Tobago would have agreed to the 25-acre parcel of land that was at that time accepted by the Santa Rosa First Peoples. In terms of the lease, Cabinet would have mandated the Attorney General's office to look into the terms of reference, as they called it at the time, and that resulted in the provision of a 30-year renewable lease. All right, so just to respond to that. Right? In terms of our closing comments, the ministry would have identified what we felt would be the critical areas in terms of the relationship, and we understand the issues, as Chief Barron would have said, there are areas of commonality and agreement, and I'm sure we would want to capitalize on those areas and recognize the uniqueness and the differences among them as well. But there is value in, wherever possible, taking advantage of those areas of commonality. And I'm sure it happens now in terms of the different celebrations that we have in August and October, etc. We definitely want to see the model Amerindian village completed, and to reiterate our recommendation that it be placed in the hands of a state enterprise and under the guidance of Chief Barrett, and also, of course, the background documents that we already have from Mr. Balkaran Singh and Dowlat. And certainly, in terms of looking at going forward, we take on board MP Haynes's comments in terms of whatever support can be provided to the Warao Nation in terms of that documentation of the things that they would want to go to cabinet for consideration, and finally to resume that interagency multi-sectoral approach to furthering the goals of the First Peoples. And I think in saying furthering those goals, I have to say really furthering the goals of Trinidad and Tobago as we recognize, honor, celebrate our First Peoples. And through that committee, we can do that in a most comprehensive manner. Thank you.
Sorry, Miss Belfon, open to you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chair. As others have said, this has certainly been a very fruitful discussion. I do appreciate our involvement here and being invited to the table. I wish to again stress that we are open and available to provide whatever support and facilitate whatever is needed in terms of research, information, and assistance in sensitizing and supporting the educational outreach for the First Peoples, all groups, or the current two that we have on board, or any others which may come forward. And just to add, in terms of my suggestion before, certainly as a National Archive, we would really appreciate to have the original records from some of our former colonial powers available locally, and we will continue our efforts as much as possible to ensure that it is here to facilitate and make easy access to all researchers and persons willing to use these records to support the various claims, and of course to educate and sensitize people. Our role, as I continue to say, is always to ensure the diverse cultures of Trinidad and Tobago are well represented in our collection. So thank you for having us.
Many thanks, Mr. Barros, Chief President of the Santa Rosa First People Community.
Thank you so much.
Words of summation.
Yes, thank you. Before I really say my last words, I want to say to the Ministry of Sport and Community Development that your recommendation for a state agency, before you recommend, we would like to have further discussion to know exactly what will be the role of that agency and guidance from us, because we do not want anything that will usurp our going forward with the Santa Rosa people heavily involved as outlined by the UN Declaration. Having said that, my closing words, in all that we have identified, meaningful recognition and understanding of the unique and inherent rights of our indigenous peoples is of paramount importance for the survival of the heritage and culture of our First Peoples. If steps are not taken to cement the proposed actions, all our collective efforts will be in vain. We therefore call for national policy to be implemented in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and following best practice from a country such as Canada, who has made progress with their First Peoples. I thank you and hope for the good outcome of this session.
Many thanks. Can I get closing remarks from the representatives of the Grand Chief of the Waru Nation?
Yes, sir. I just want to read the solemn proclamation. Trinidad and Tobago solemnly proclaims the following United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a standard of achievement to be pursued in a spirit of partnership and mutual respect. Now, Article 1, Indigenous peoples have the right to full enjoyment as a collective or as individuals of all human rights and fundamental freedoms as recognized in the Charter of the United Nations, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and International Human Rights. Now, this implies in law that the United Nations Declaration, which is not ratified by the government or by the state, right, is a sort of a travesty. I mean, it's 15 years this document has been before the government or before the state. Is it that the state don't want to recognize us because they want to claim our lands unlawfully and continue to do so? That's just one aspect of it. Now, what I want to say is that, to me, this Parliamentary Joint Select Committee, as well as I appreciate, the views and so on of the parties involved, right? And especially you, sir, in the manner in which you conducted yourself, right? If we do not recognize the law or the laws that govern the rights of indigenous people, then we've been known before the entire world, before the United Nations, as a lawless society. And all this song and dance, all you come here to give it with the cultural recognition and all this kind of thing. Culture is something that we have a right to preserve ourselves. The law gives us that right. If we wish to share, then so be it. But you can't come and force us to do this, and this is what the attempt of this committee is doing. It said it's come to deal with human rights, and it has not done with it. It said, okay, you will give you something at the end, you look at it, now it's something else. So then,
Ms. Representative from the Waru Nation, your points are noted. However, I think you have, there was a certain meat of the discussion that we had moved away from that thinking, and we had recommendations were made, and definitely will continue to be made for conversation. And in addition to conversation, moving forward, from all the representatives who mentioned that we recognize the role of the indigenous, we understand whom the indigenous are, and all that have come forward is dialogue to ensure that we can all move forward for the satisfaction and for the achieving of the goals of this committee. I would have liked your summation to be a little more positive in recognizing the conversation this morning. So I'm giving you a few more moments to go at it, and I keep the floor open to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Sir, recognition is a legal term. It is defined according to Black's Law Dictionary as the authority to confirm an action. And we use recognition outside of the law here. Now, formal admission that a person or entity has a particular status. This status is not being recognized at all here. A nation's act formally acknowledging the existence of another nation or national government. For international law, official action by a country acknowledging expressly or by implication, de facto or de jure, the existence of a government or country or the situation such as a change of territorial sovereignty. That's one.
Thank you.
Wait a minute, sir. Ratification.
You're going into meat of matters that we have. This is the end of the meeting, and we have passed that position, and I would like, all your points have been taken into consideration, and we do understand what you're saying, and I would like to thank you for your presence and contribution to this. I would like to thank all officials and contributors to today's proceedings, committee members, who have participated remotely for this virtual hearing. I would like to thank the staff of the Office of the Parliament for your procedural and logistical support and the viewing and listening audience. I'd just like to make one last note here, and saying the committee recently presented to Parliament its second report on the human rights of the socially displaced persons of Trinidad and Tobago, with specific focus on their treatment and relocation from Port of Spain public spaces. The committee did some good work, and should the public wish to see the committee's findings and recommendations, the report is available on the Parliament's website at www.ttparliament.org. I now declare this meeting end and is now adjourned. Many thanks to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I know. Abraham. Mr.
Go ahead, Mr. Ai.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think that going forward, that Mr. Thomas Isaac,